Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Yakino. On this week's episode, special guest and BPC Fellow Ruth Wasem joins us to unpack President Biden's recent actions related to the refugee admissions cap for 2021. Then, we'll turn to the administration's decision to increase the number of H-2B visas and discuss the bipartisan immigration talks currently going on in the Senate. More of that to come. Stick around. Earlier this month, President Biden signed an executive order extending a 15,000 refugee admissions cap issued by his predecessor, Donald Trump, through the end of September, although he reallocated the 15,000 visas away from priorities that Trump had put in place and back to a traditional geographic distribution. However, in signing the order, Biden shelved a plan announced in February to increase the cap to 62,500 people. Almost immediately, the administration faced swift criticism from refugee and immigration groups, who saw it as a particular betrayal by a president they had wanted to move swiftly in reversing the refugee policies of the Republican administration previously. Only a day after his administration faced a flurry of criticism, Biden announced that they had a plan to set a final increased refugee cap for the remainder of this fiscal year by May 15th. To help us understand all this drama over refugee admissions is BPC Fellow Ruth Wasem and This Week regular Teresa Cardinal-Brown. Teresa and Ruth, welcome back to the show. I will let you both take it from here.
Thanks, Rachel. And Ruth, welcome back to This Week in Immigration. Thanks for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you and about immigration and what's going on in Washington.
Well, great. So let's dive right into a couple of questions about the whole thing that happened with the refugee cap that I've been mulling over myself. And I think probably our listeners could maybe use some background here. So let's get a little background about how the refugee admissions cap has been set, what the process is. So what is exactly the presidential determination process for refugee resettlement, and how does it work?
Well, the refugee determination is something that's set in statute in the 1980 Refugee Act. And it was done to bring some flexibility, but also some control over refugee admissions. And it hinges on the president consulting with Congress every year to set the number of refugees that are going to be admitted. So each year, the president submits a report to the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it contains the proposed refugee worldwide ceiling and regional allocations for the upcoming fiscal year. Following congressional consultations on the proposal by the administration, the president issues a presidential determination setting the refugee numbers for that year.
Okay. So that's the process that's been undertaken. I know President Trump did it each year he was in office. Is it unusual or usual that a president, once the determination is set, would revisit it during that same fiscal year? And what about under a change of administration like we've seen now?
Excellent question, because clearly when there's a change of administration, there might be a different set of priorities. The most common time that it's revisited has to do with immigration emergencies and refugee emergencies. Mm-hmm. And the law provides for that. There's a section in the Immigration and Nationality Act that provides for revising refugee admissions numbers if the president, again in consultation with Congress, determines that the admission of refugees is justified by either grave humanitarian concerns or it's otherwise in the national interest. And there have been occasions in the past where after the initial determination, the president has revised upwards the number of refugee admissions. So I can think of at least 4 times in the past that this has happened.
And I recall that President Trump lowered the cap that President Obama had set right before he departed, right? So between administrations that can happen. And of course, President Biden said he was going to increase the cap. And that's what started this hoo-ha, if you will, about a week ago or so, is that he had said he was going to raise it. And then he had told Congress he was going to raise it, right? They did those consultations. And then the announcement was, we're not going to raise it. We're just going to realign the regional preferences. That created obviously a lot of I'll say a little bit of a firestorm among the refugee community, right? The refugee advocates and the resettlement organizations had been expecting this higher number, and then they didn't see it. The administration had sort of hemmed and hawed about this, and now they're saying they might increase it again. But they're talking also about one of the reasons they didn't raise it was that there was a challenge for refugee resettlement given concern, and that generated their concerns. So can you talk a little bit about why would, for example, the challenges at the border, would that have any impact on the refugee agencies that do resettlement?
Refugee policy and asylum policy, we tend to think of as distinct and separate pathways. Refugees are people displaced abroad, asylum people who arrive at our borders, and from an admissions process and a policy view, even though they both meet the same statutory definition, we tend to think of those as two distinct and separate tracks. So where you start to see the confluence is in two places. One, it has to do with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And let me, for our listeners, because I know you know this, Teresa, there are several federal departments, three major federal departments involved in refugee admissions and the asylum process. There's, of course, the Department of Homeland Security that handles both asylum seekers, but also the refugee officers that make the individual refugee determinations work for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. There's the Department of State's Population, Refugee, and Migration Bureau, and they handle the refugee policy making and setups abroad, and bringing refugees that have been identified by the United States to the United States. So that part of identification and placement, and then there's in the Department of Health and Human Services the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which was created in the 1980 Act, and so generally. When we thought of people coming in from abroad, we basically saw this as, aside from the USCIS role, as state and Health and Human Services being the key players in handling admissions, placement, and resettlement kinds of programs. When the Department of Homeland Security was created, a decision was made to move the handling of unaccompanied children, which at that time was a pretty small number, that should not be done by the Immigration Services, where it had been done by the old INS, but that should be done by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So, and there was a lot of sense behind that move to put that responsibility there. So here we have these different pieces that you also need to bear in mind during the Trump years, because the numbers were so low. These entities had very reduced capacities and reduced funding, weren't geared up yet for another large-scale resettlement program.
So just to clarify, Office of Refugee Resettlement during the Trump years, they saw both a reduced number of refugees coming from overseas, and because of the policies put in place, fewer unaccompanied children at the border. And so both of the things that office was charged with doing where there was less capacity when Biden came in.
Right. And they don't actually do when you think of it, it's not like they're providing human services. They basically provide funding for voluntary agencies. And they have a group of refugee resettlement and organizations, faith-based and state-based, and lots of entities out there that had been receiving money to do these things. So at the local level, the people involved, whether it's with unaccompanied children or resettling refugees, those entities had seen a dramatic drop in their funding. So they had also laid off staff, cut back in what they were doing because, their refugees weren't coming in and children weren't being placed. So things had really slowed down. When you have and this has been the real issue, and you know this, but one of the real issues with the problems at the border was that the Office of Refugee Resettlement hadn't gotten the capacity up yet to take the children into their custody, to take them from Customs and Border Protection and find appropriate places for them. Partly, of course, due to the pandemic. And we can't forget the effect that COVID has had on the kinds of group quarters that you would normally put the unaccompanied children in while you're trying to find a proper and suitable home placement for them. So that was yet an added wrinkle. So ORR was already straining with trying to deal with the children, and then an increase to try to ratchet up for the refugee resettlement. Even though it's slightly different offices within ORR, it still is a strain on their capacity and what their priorities are, because usually places like that are pretty kind of lean and mean, and people shift around to deal with what needs to be done at that moment. So having two competing priorities, no doubt, would have been quite stressful for them.
So we're now hearing kind of mixed messages from the administration. Just today, there was news that they may yet increase the cap to, I think it was 62,500 for the remainder of this fiscal year, which ends September 30th. But there's a lot of doubt that they'll even be able to settle that many, partially because of the limitations you just talked about, that, they haven't necessarily freed up more money. They've had to use more money for the children at the border. There should be separate pots of money for the refugee resettlement of the kids at the border. I'm not sure that's so clear, but, do you think Congress has a role here in sort of making this happen? Is there going to be a request to Congress for more money for all of this, do you think?
Well, certainly more money is, when you're facing something like this, helps, but it's not the only thing that's in play. And we're already well into the fiscal year. So if you look back at Biden's initial pledge to go back to 120,000 refugees a year, or somewhere in that ballpark, when he says that he wants to do 60,000, that's about a half of a fiscal year. So coming in saying, that really means getting back up to the historic highs of the refugee resettlement program, the days when we admitted our peak number of refugees. That's a lot to do when you essentially had almost a shutdown of refugee and asylum processes. So, I see this as a tension between aspiration and capacity. Mm-hmm. And what do you realistically say? People may sincerely want to go up to 62,000, but getting everything ramped up and getting the additional funding, because the budget was set on what President Trump had proposed for this fiscal year, which was 15,000. So you have to get get everything up and running. That's no small matter. But there's no question that there are people, refugees, who are in desperate need of resettlement in the United States. So the pressure is on, and it's, you hear from a variety of different groups, well, who should we prioritize among this pent up? Just like we had people pent up, and I think it's been interesting to see the analysis of the flows along the southern border, how people have measured how much of that was pent up from the shutdown because of COVID and remain in Mexico, and how much is just the optimism of a new administration fueling migrant flows. And but with refugees, there's clearly an urgency because the slowdown that we've had the last couple of years.
And I think it's important for us to distinguish. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the difference between asylees and refugees, but there is a somewhat important distinction here. You mentioned USCIS is involved in both processes, but we have well over 65,500 refugees who have been approved already, gone through all of the background checks and everything else. They've been told that they do qualify, ready to come to the United States. They're just waiting for the flights, basically, and the resettlement process in the United States to be ready for them to arrive. the asylees arriving at the border haven't yet been adjudicated, right? So that's another sort of distinction when you're thinking about prioritization. We have to deal with the people arriving because they're here, but in terms of process and priority, the folks abroad have the government has already decided they are worthy of coming to the United States. I think we need to understand that and make that clear so that, when we conflate these as two priorities of the administration and resources and where they go, we also have to understand what the processes are that talk about both of them.
That's a very important distinction, Teresa. People that have already been through the rigorous screening of both whether they meet the definition, but the background checks and all of the hoops that individuals go through, not just to establish that they're a refugee, but that they are a priority and of special national interest and humanitarian concern for the United States. So these individuals that have been approved have been through an exhaustive and rigorous process.
Yeah, the average is like 18 months for them to go through all of that. And obviously it's been stretched out longer now.
And many have left their homes. They've already, they were ready to leave. They don't have a place to be, because they had been accepted in the United States.
Well, and then we know that there were flights that were scheduled, that people were on planes or about to get on planes. They were canceled. Colleagues of mine who work in refugee resettlement said, we were ready to receive them. We had bought groceries for their apartment, and then it was all canceled. And so, we've seen some of that kind of distraction. So just bottom line, you talked about the difference between, aspiration and sort of what you can actually do on the ground. There's also the distinction between kind of the policy that you'd like to see and implementation, right? And what it seems to me what we're seeing right now is that the challenges of actually implementing the policies you want to do can be a lot harder than thinking of the policies you want.
Exactly. And that's where, the nexus of administration and management with policies is a critical thing that many of us in the policy world forget if you haven't worked on the management side. And one of the other areas that I see coming out of the Biden administration is wanting to have the State Department more involved in Central America in terms of, instead of people coming as asylum seekers, having more of a ways to deal with that flow in the sending countries. For example, we already know that they have reestablished for the children a program that the Obama administration had, where they're trying to identify unaccompanied children or children that would be trying to enter on their own with family in the United States, trying to preempt this flow of asylum seekers. And the important role that the Department of State can play there, that's also something that's tugging at Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau.
It's getting that stood up again, right? And you mentioned before, and again, it bears repeating, we still have to deal with COVID, and many of the facilities in those countries, many of the embassies and consulates that would be doing this have also been shut down because of COVID and haven't yet reopened, because not all of our foreign service personnel have been able to get vaccinated where they are. So, again, operations, implementation can be the bane of the best policy ideas in the world. And hopefully the Biden administration will be able to get its arms around this soon. Ruth, thank you so much again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
I look forward to talking with you again, Teresa.
Up next, news on the H-2B temporary non-agricultural visa. 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration has announced plans to raise the cap on seasonal worker visas in the U.S. by 22,000. In a statement released last month, the Department of Homeland Security said it would be raising the ceiling to ensure that American businesses are equipped with the resources needed to recover successfully and contribute to the economic health of local communities as the nation's economy continues to reopen safely. DHS also noted that 6,000 of the additional H-2B visas would be reserved specifically for workers from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala as part of Biden's executive order on creating a comprehensive regional framework to address the causes of migration in Central America. Teresa, that was quite a mouthful. And we spent a lot of time on this podcast and in our research talking about how expanding avenues for legal immigration is a vital component to border management. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of this announcement, especially given the fact that legal immigration is often not at the forefront of reform campaigns?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand sort of where the importance of the H-2B visa in the overall immigration system. So the H-2B visa, as you mentioned, is a temporary visa for non-agricultural but seasonal work. And if you look at our overall immigration system, there are very few legal visas and opportunities for people who would come to work in the United States in jobs that are lesser skilled and maybe lower wage. So the agricultural visa is one of them, the H-2A, and the H-2B is its counterpart. But other than the H-2B visa, there really aren't a lot of other visas, and this visa is capped at $66,000 a year. So if you think of the types of jobs that a lot of immigrants coming from south of the border would be employed in, they fit in these kinds of industries, things like construction and landscaping, hospitality, forestry. These are jobs that a lot of immigrants would work in, but the limitations on this visa mean that they don't have the opportunity, most of them, to get a legal visa to come. And so it is one of the reasons why we see a lot of unlawful migration for people seeking work. So what's interesting to me about this announcement is it's the first time we have actually seen an administration of either party commit visas for the sole purpose of trying to, if you will, divert unlawful migration to a legal channel by holding aside these visas for nationals of the countries from which we're seeing so much migration right now. So it'll be an interesting experiment. I mean, it's only 6,000 visas, and right now we're seeing 6,000 people a week at the US-Mexico border. So it's not a lot, but it will be interesting to see whether there is enough uptake of these visas in the region, whether it prompts demand for more visas. Maybe it's a way of the administration trying to promote employers in the United States to try recruiting if they need foreign workers to recruit from those areas. And I think that that's an interesting avenue to pursue. It's the first time I think that we've seen a specific, as I said, public policy that acknowledges that providing an alternative legal visa may be a way of forestalling some undocumented migration.
So you touched on this a little bit, and while increasing this year's cap is helpful for employers seeking to hire in the summer season, it's not a long-term solution for legal immigration reform. So how do you see this announcement influencing future negotiations on immigration reform in the near term?
So, I mean, it's been interesting to see that in an era where we've seen Congress essentially stalemate on most major parts of immigration reform, every year, it seems they're able to agree on allowing DHS to increase the H-2B cap, which tells you the widespread demand, that it's bipartisan, and that it impacts an awful lot of members and their constituents who understand the importance of these programs. In many places, these programs are the only way that employers can hire sufficient workforce for whatever their season is. These jobs have to be offered to U.S. workers first to apply, and they cannot be offered to an immigrant unless there aren't enough U.S. workers who apply, and that is certified by the Department of Labor every year. And these are industries that have traditionally had a hard time finding sufficient people. Rachel, you've written about the need for seasonal workers in resort towns like Montauk, where the local population isn't enough to meet the demands when the vacationers come in the summer. And there's just not enough people moving out from the city who would be also willing to take those jobs. A lot of these are jobs in places that are parts of the country where there's not a large unemployed local population, and there aren't enough people from other parts of the country willing to move for a temporary or seasonal job. And that's one of the reasons why it's hard to recruit and why these programs help support these local economies. It's interesting to see why there is so much bipartisan support for these programs. Could this be a framework similar to we saw in the Farm Workforce Modernization Act? If we can come up with a framework for these type of workers to revise that program, this may be a way of doing immigration reform essentially in smaller packages. And I think it's worth thinking about, certainly something we've been talking about at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we'll see if we can get folks on the Hill to work with us on that.
Well, that's the perfect segue to our final segment, a discussion on the bipartisan talks in the Senate on immigration reform. So a bipartisan group of senators led by Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin of Illinois met Wednesday afternoon to explore the possibility of immigration reform legislation that could address the surge of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border. The talks come amid what Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas says is on pace to be the biggest migrant surge in 20 years. And also last week, a bipartisan and bicameral team of members introduced a separate bill to revise the reception and processing of asylum seekers at the border. To help us dig into these issues is Managing Director of BPC Action, Laura Hall. Laura, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I think I speak for many when I say that these talks might be a bit of a surprise, especially given the divisive role that immigration has historically played in Congress. Can you give us a bit of background on who is participating in these talks and what the primary pieces of legislation the talks are focusing on?
Sure. And I think that your surprise is fair, because I do think that immigration is certainly something that has a divisive history or a divisive moment right now. But I'm not sure throughout history it's always been quite as divisive. We've had several opportunities over the years in the Senate where kind of gangs and groups have come together in a bipartisan nature to discuss immigration. And I think given the current makeup of the Senate, that there's a pretty even split with Vice President Harris being the deciding vote. Anything that happens on immigration is probably going to happen in a bipartisan manner. So I think senators who want to work on this issue are realizing that and kind of acting accordingly. As far as who's in the talks, it's kind of some of the old guard that have been involved in immigration for many years. Kind of Dick Durbin, as you mentioned, from Illinois. We've got John Cornyn from Texas, who represents obviously a wide swath of the southern border. Lindsey Graham has been an active participant over the years with Senator Durbin on DREAM legislation, helping that kind of group of folks who came to the United States as young children. And then some of the more moderate senators from both the Republican and the Democratic Party. You've got Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Susan Collins from Maine, Michael Bennet from Colorado. I think it's a group that wants to get something done on this issue. As far as pieces of legislation the talks are focusing on, my understanding is they're not quite at that point yet. I think they're trying to get centered around big picture issues and find places of agreement. I'm not sure they're at the point where they're drilling down on specific pieces of legislation, though I think the hope is to get there eventually. So I think the fact that they're even talking to each other and starting these conversations is the first step, the key to kind of rebuilding some of these bipartisan ties that have frayed over the past couple of years.
So jumping off of that, Teresa, do you think these talks kind of echo the beginnings, the inklings of the Gang of Eight in 2013?
It's interesting you should say that because, when gangs have formed or groups have formed, it's usually started out kind of similarly. Well, we think we want to work on this issue. We think we can work together. Where do we start? And I think that's how it has to happen, right? Even though we've seen lots of attempts like this over the last decade and a half, honestly, going back to 2000, I think it's important that members have to kind of find their own way every time. The politics have changed. The membership may be slightly different, even though some of them have participated in these before. The staffs are new. Many of them have brand new staff that haven't been through these kind of talks before. And so they have to go to the get to know you dance again. So I think that I agree with Laura. It's a very positive development. And the talks appear to be serious. The members are really trying to see if they can come up with some things that they can work on together. And it's a counterpoint to a lot of the kind of messaging legislation and messaging bills that you see sometimes under both Republican and Democratic control of Congress. They're trying to figure out where they can find common ground and reach across the aisle. We have to see if they can come to agreement. Obviously, we'd love to support this in any way we can. As Laura said, given the numbers, we believe that any major change has to come from a bipartisan basis. So hopefully they'll be looking at things like legalization of the Dreamers. I mean, obviously Senator Durbin is leading this, and that's been his number one priority for more than 20 years. They'll probably also look at solutions on the border and what can be done about that right now. But we'll also see, maybe they'll look at legal immigration reforms. Maybe they'll look at other opportunities to reform the system for the future. So I think it's just a matter of them figuring out what's the stuff they can easily agree upon, what's the next stuff of things that they might be able to agree upon, and then, how do they get from there.
So Laura, jumping off of that, what about the border legislation that is both bipartisan and bicameral? Does this have legs to stand on?
So I think everyone's kind of watching what's happening on the border. I believe President Biden is going to be discussing that in his joint address to Congress. There are Vice President Harris has been appointed to kind of a little bit of a border czar to look at what's going on. Congress is also looking at what's happening on the southern border. The Bipartisan Border Solutions Act is the bill you're referring to. It was introduced late last week by Senators Cornyn and Sinema, both border state members and bipartisan duo. Cornyn's a Republican and Sinema is a Democrat. And then there was also a companion bill on the House side by Congressmen Cuellar and Gonzalez, Republican and Democrat, both from Texas. It's one of those remains to be seen issues. It's certainly always an opening gambit when a bill is dropped and it gets the conversation going. As far as moving it forward, I think that still remains to be seen. There's a lot of passion attached to this issue, especially when it relates to the border. I think talking is the good first step, trying to find areas of common ground. The fact that it already has a bit of a bipartisan pairing is a good thing. I think there are still a lot of folks in the Democratic Party and probably within the Republican Party to the flanks that maybe aren't quite yet on board with this approach in this bill. I think that there's a little bit of work to do to kind of broaden out from the center and see if this might be a place to find agreement. I'm of the mindset that the more things that are on the table, the better the conversation is. So let's put a bunch of stuff out there, get a bunch of people talking, let them see that immigration is an issue that might have a bipartisan path forward, and then kind of see what comes out of that.
So Teresa, I know we don't like to predict the future here on the podcast, but do you foresee any potential hiccups or sticking points in future talks, should there be any down the line? And do you think the recent nomination of Ed Gonzalez to be the director of ICE will play into the future of the talks at all?
So, you're right. I don't like to predict Congress because the easy prediction is nothing will happen, right? That's the default. And I want to hope for more than that. But it's important to understand that President Biden has said he wants to see immigration reform done. So it is a presidential priority. He's got lots of other priorities, but it is something that he has sort of leaned into, and we probably will see him lean into it again on his speech to Congress this evening. So that provides a little incentive, I think, for Congress to actually work on the issue. Laura is absolutely right. There will always be people that want to pick apart something, find a reason to say no. We have to help them find more reasons to say yes. I think these border bills are very important, both because of the policy enacted in them. They're approaching the border in a new way to manage migration differently. They're very similar to many of the recommendations we've made in the past about things like immigration FEMA and having a surge capacity at the border, building reception centers that are different. I think that's what's new about this, is that it's a different approach than the traditional, reform the asylum system to make it harder and put more border security and walls at the border, right? I think it's a different approach. And I think that's new and that deserves to have a look. As far as the broader immigration debate goes, you're right. I mean, we now have a nominee for ICE. Ed Gonzalez is a sheriff in Harris County, Texas, which is where Houston is. He has been involved in immigration discussions before, and so he has some background. I think most importantly for ICE is that he's a law enforcement officer. I think that law enforcement agencies like ICE and CBP, to have people nominated for those positions that have quote, carried the badge is important for them to build respect and the support of the rank and file members of those agencies. So I think that's important. But, this nomination is not going to be uncontentious. I mean, we know that there are folks on the left who would like to see ICE go away. We know that there are folks on the right who want to see ICE go back to the way it was under Trump. So it's likely to be a contentious hearing. And when those hearings get contentious, when the nominations get contentious, when the votes are close, that sometimes can have a spillover impact into other conversations that are going on. I hope that's not the case. Maybe it'll be the opposite. Maybe the fact that there are bipartisan conversations on immigration can help there be a little bit more agreement on the nominations going forward. We'll have to see how that plays out. All in all, though, we expected this year to be a busy one for immigration on the Hill. We're seeing that happen. And I think that's good, because we need to make some progress.
And that's the perfect place to end it. A busy time on the Hill means more conversations on the podcast. So thank you both for coming back this week, and look forward to future conversations. That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Iacono. This Week in Immigration was created by Teresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Teresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tewahada and Ethan Plotkin produce and edit our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.